He crushed the rainbow flag beneath his boot as if it were an enemy on a battlefield. Then, with a lighter in one hand and pride in the other, he set it on fire. Flames flickered against the summer air while voices screamed in disbelief. The man who burned it, Caleb Wyatt, didn't flinch. His jaw was tight, his arms stiff. His eyes stared forward like a soldier marching toward a war no one else signed up for. He shouted over the smoke, "Not in my town." And in that moment, someone filmed him. Caleb Wyatt was 33, a former Marine, a part-time security guard, and the son of Richard Wyatt, a retired police officer who believed weakness was more dangerous than violence. Caleb lived with his father in a modest one-story home on the outskirts of a small Florida town, a place where Pride Month was something people whispered about but never celebrated openly. Until this year, the town square had never seen a pride parade before. But in June, organizers finally received approval for a modest march, complete with flags, handmade signs, and volunteers offering free water bottles under the sweltering sun. It wasn't a riot, it wasn't loud, but for people like Caleb, who had grown up hearing that rainbow colors didn't belong on a man's chest unless he'd earned them in combat, it felt like an invasion. So he called two old friends from his Marine days. One worked construction, one sold guns legally, but bragged often about those he didn't. They met at dawn. They didn't carry weapons, just intentions. Caleb wore a faded military shirt and combat boots. He brought the lighter, another brought the flag. They waited until the parade reached the center. There, under a bronze statue of a local war hero, they stepped forward without warning. The crowd parted slightly, confused more than afraid. That's when Caleb tore the flag into two pieces, then three, then threw it on the ground and crushed it with his boot. The sound of polyester tearing was drowned by gasps. Then he struck the lighter. The flames rose quickly, and just as quickly, a volunteer in medical scrubs stepped forward to stop him. His name was Julien Rivera. He wasn't big, he wasn't loud. He didn't even try to touch Caleb, just reached toward the burning cloth, maybe to stop it from spreading. But Caleb shoved him hard in the chest. Julien stumbled. He fell backward, hard, and hit the pavement, and the camera caught it all. It caught the shouting, the fire, the foot slamming down, Julien's fall, Caleb's fury. Within hours, the video spread across Twitter and Instagram. Millions watched. Some cheered. Many condemned. Caleb's name was suddenly in headlines. He was praised by a small extremist group in a neighboring town, and the local sheriff's office began an official investigation into hate-motivated violence. Caleb didn't blink. He believed he had won. His boots still smelled like burned fabric. He even smiled at the thought of people finally knowing where he stood. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly imagine, was that life was already on its way back to collect every debt he owed. Subscribe to Heartstorie to hear what happens in part 2, where Caleb thinks he's victorious, but the world has just begun writing his sentence. The celebration didn't last long. 2 days after the video went viral, Caleb Wyatt was called into the office of the security firm where he worked part-time. The meeting lasted less than 5 minutes. No apology, no room for argument, just a folder placed on the desk, and the words, "We can't be affiliated with this." The termination was immediate. By the end of the week, local businesses that once waved at Caleb began pulling back. The grocery store he visited every Friday stopped making eye contact. The gym removed his name from their member board. His own neighbors, who once praised his military background, now kept their curtains drawn when he passed. He tried to act unfazed, tried to laugh it off. "Let them be afraid," he told Mark, his closest friend and former comrade from the Marines. Mark was the kind of man who enjoyed watching the world burn as long as he didn't get caught in the flame. He offered Caleb a piece of advice. "Maybe disappear for a while, Charles," he said. "Head to the mountains. Let the noise settle." But Caleb shook his head. He believed he had done nothing wrong. He claimed he was defending real American values. He said the rainbow flag had no place in a town where veterans were buried with folded ones of red, white, and blue. The louder the backlash, the more righteous he felt. He never once thought about Julien Rivera. Julien had suffered a mild concussion. The shove had cracked his elbow and forced 3 stitches above his brow. He was placed on mandatory medical leave from the health center where he worked as a charge nurse. For a few days, he stayed home, resting, icing his arm, and watching the firestorm unfold online. A local news station ran a short feature on the Pride incident. Most of it focused on the investigation. But near the end, they aired a short clip of Julien being interviewed outside the clinic. His arm was in a sling, his voice was calm, and yet his words struck harder than any protest sign. "I don't need an apology," he said. "I just hope that those who hate us will remember when the time comes we are still human, and sometimes we're the only ones who can save them." The words echoed louder than Caleb expected. He watched it by accident, just a random TV segment playing in the background while he ate dinner at a local bar. But when he heard Julien's name, he looked up. He saw the bandages. He saw the eyes that still refused to show anger, and he called it fake. He muttered under his breath that it was all victim propaganda, that Julien was playing the sympathy card. He mocked the statement, repeated it sarcastically to Mark later that night, and laughed like it meant nothing. But life, once again, wasn't finished with him. 3 nights later, after leaving that same bar, Caleb lost control of his motorcycle on a curve just past the highway. The speed was too high, the street too slick, the gravel too loose. His body hit the road before the bike even landed. Metal tore across his left leg. His side slammed into a guardrail. His helmet cracked. He doesn't remember the fall. He doesn't remember the ambulance ride. What he remembers next is the white light of the recovery room, the beeping machines, the pressure in his abdomen, the voice of a nurse calling his name over and over, and the sudden suffocating feeling that something inside him was broken. The doctors told him he'd suffered blunt trauma to his liver and lost a dangerous amount of blood. His type AB negative was rare. The hospital had already exhausted its regular stock. The local blood bank had just 1 matching unit left, donated days ago by a volunteer from the Pride event. The name on the label, Julien Rivera. And just like that, the man Caleb had shoved to the pavement, the one he called weak, disgusting, and fake, was the only reason he might live. Caleb couldn't speak. At first, out of shock, then out of rage. He demanded they wait, demanded a second option. But his blood pressure was crashing. His organs weren't waiting for his pride. And then he felt it, a hand gripping his, strong and trembling. His father. Richard Wyatt had stood tall his entire life, but now bent slightly forward, eyes moist, voice hoarse. He looked down at his son and said the one thing Caleb never expected. "You're not a hero. You're just a man about to die. And the man you hate is the one who's saving you." The room fell silent. The transfusion began, and the blood flowed in. Caleb lived. But something inside him, something deeper than his wounds, had already started to change. The pain was sharp and slow. It moved like cold fire through Caleb's ribs as he drifted in and out of sleep. The machines around him beeped in steady rhythm, like a choir of reminders that he was still alive, but only barely. He had survived the crash, but his body was failing. The impact had torn vessels around his liver. Internal bleeding had gone unchecked 4 hours. By the time he arrived at the hospital, his blood pressure had dropped to a whisper, and his oxygen saturation was flirting with 0. Surgery was fast, temporary, not enough. What he needed now was blood, and not just any blood AB negative, one of the rarest types. A nurse explained this slowly, gently. There was no time to wait for an out-of-state supply. They had 1 unit left, just 1, donated a few days earlier, during the Pride event that had shaken the entire town. The name on the donor form had been flagged, not for its controversy, but for its uncommon match, Julien Rivera, the same man Caleb had shoved. The same man who had fallen, the same man whose voice had reached him through a hospital TV screen not long ago, saying that sometimes we're the only ones who can save them. The irony cut deeper than his wounds. At first, Caleb refused. His voice was hoarse, but the rage in his throat pushed through. He cursed. He demanded they find another donor, find another solution. He said he didn't want that man's blood. He said it as if blood carried opinions, as if a transfusion would taint him. But the doctors didn't have time to argue. Neither did his body. That's when the door opened, and Richard Wyatt stepped inside. He wasn't in uniform, hadn't been for years, but he still carried the presence of a man used to being listened to. For a moment, he stood still, just watching his son, his face, usually hard as stone, now carved with something else: grief, fear, and a terrible understanding that he could lose the last piece of his family. He walked forward, took Caleb's hand, and leaned close. His words weren't loud, but they struck like thunder. "You're not a hero," Richard whispered. "You're a man about to die, and the man you hate is the one who's saving you." There was no anger in his voice, only weariness, a lifetime of belief systems unraveling in a single moment. Caleb didn't respond. He let the transfusion begin. He felt the cool sensation of life entering him, drop by drop, from a bag marked with a name he'd never forget: Julien Rivera. Somewhere in his mind, he expected to feel shame, or disgust, or at least discomfort. But what crept in, quietly and without permission, was something else entirely. Relief. He lived. The bleeding slowed, the oxygen stabilized. His vitals began to steady like ripples on water after a storm. He wasn't miraculously healed, but he wasn't dying anymore. He lay there, still hooked up to tubes and wires, and stared at the ceiling. His father sat silently nearby. Neither of them spoke. There was too much weight in the air to lift with words. The next morning, the nurse came in to check vitals. Her scrubs were decorated with tiny rainbow hearts, something Caleb might have rolled his eyes at just a week ago. Now, he looked at them without comment. She smiled kindly as she adjusted his IV. "You're lucky," she said. "If that unit hadn't been donated when it was, we might have lost you." He nodded, barely. She didn't mention the name. She didn't have to. He already knew. When she left, Caleb reached for the remote and turned off the TV. The silence settled again. He closed his eyes, but sleep didn't come. What came instead was memory. The flag, the lighter, the shove, and now the blood. It lived inside him, and nothing. No protest, no belief, no twisted loyalty could undo that fact. He had survived, but the man who once believed he'd never owe anything to someone like Julien Rivera now owed him life itself. And whether he liked it or not, that debt had changed everything. Caleb returned home with a limp and a quiet that didn't match the noise he had once carried everywhere. The house felt smaller, the town colder, not because the seasons had changed, but because everything else had. He no longer wore the old Marine shirts, no longer raised his voice in the grocery store, no longer walked with the confidence of someone convinced the world owed him respect. His body was healing, but his name was still broken in the mouths of others. The job was gone. Not just the security firm, others too. Every application came back with polite silence or short refusals. Some businesses didn't respond at all. Others remembered the video. Caleb had become a symbol no one wanted near their door. His friends disappeared slowly. First Mark, who stopped returning calls, then others who had once laughed with him in bars, cheered when the flag burned, offered praise when he shouted into crowds. Now they looked away in public, pretended not to see him. The ones who stayed were the loudest online, but nowhere to be found when Caleb needed someone to talk to. Even his father grew distant. Richard had been the strongest voice in Caleb's life, but now he spoke less, watched more. He sat by the window in the evenings, staring out at nothing, occasionally so. He'd turned to Caleb with a look, one that carried more regret than judgment. Caleb began waking early, cleaning things that didn't need cleaning, walking long loops around the neighborhood just to avoid being still. He stopped checking the news, stopped scrolling social media. It was too much a constant mirror to what he had done and who he had become. One morning, unable to sleep, he sat at the kitchen table and stared at a blank piece of paper. The hospital discharge form sat next to it. The name Julien Rivera was printed in the small, neat letters. Under it, the words donor confirmation. Caleb picked up a pen and started to write. He didn't plan the words. They just came, heavy and uneven. He wrote about the crash, about the hospital, about the blood. He wrote about shame, not the kind others threw at him, but the kind that grew from within when no one else was watching. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't expect it. He only wrote that he was sorry, that he knew he had failed as a man, that nothing he could do would undo the hate he had helped carry. When he finished, he folded the letter and placed it inside a plain white envelope. He wrote Julien's name on the front, but he never mailed it. The envelope sat on his nightstand for weeks, then months. It yellowed at the edges from sunlight and dust. Caleb would glance at it sometimes, thinking maybe today would be the day, but it never was. Instead, he began going to church, not to pray, not to confess, just to sit, to listen. There was something about hearing other people's pain that made his own feel less like punishment and more like responsibility. One Sunday, after service, as people lingered in the pews, Caleb stepped outside into the warm air. Near the edge of the church courtyard stood a boy, thin black hoodie, rainbow pin clipped awkwardly to the fabric. The boy looked about 17. His name was Tyrese. His face was streaked with dried tears. He stood alone, his hands shaking slightly as he gripped the straps of his backpack. Caleb didn't approach. He simply stood near enough to listen. A woman, kind-faced and older, asked Tyrese why he had been crying, and the boy said, "They kicked me out of school for wearing this." He pointed to the pin. "They said I was a distraction, but I wasn't trying to be loud. I just wanted to be seen." Then he added, barely above a whisper, "I just want to be myself, that's all." The words hung in the air like smoke. They drifted over to Caleb, wrapped around his ribs, and settled into a place deeper than guilt. For the first time, Caleb understood that silence had weight. And his had been crushing someone else all along. He thought of the letter again, still unopened, still unsent. But the shame that had kept him quiet was no longer enough to justify doing nothing. The square looked different now. A year had passed. Another June arrived. The air still held that heavy Florida heat, but the people moved differently, freer, louder, more unafraid. Banners danced between lampposts. Music echoed from nearby speakers, and in the center of it all, a rainbow flag waved proudly in the sun, untouched and unchallenged. This time, no one tried to tear it down. Among the volunteers in white shirts, handing out cold bottles of water, wiping sweat from children's brows, and taping first aid signs to metal poles, stood a man who had once come to this very spot to destroy what he now helped protect. Caleb Wyatt. No military gear, no anger in his face, no camera trailing him, just a plain white shirt with a small sticker on the front, event support. And tucked into his shirt pocket, small, unassuming, but visible, was a tiny rainbow flag, folded neatly and pinned over his heart. Julien Rivera saw him before Caleb saw him. He was crouched near a supply table, restocking gauze and ice packs, wearing the same kind of scrubs he always wore. His arm had long since healed. The scar above his brow had faded into a faint reminder, barely noticeable unless you looked for it. But Caleb looked. He didn't walk quickly. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stepped forward through the crowd until he stood in front of Julien. There was no crowd watching this time, no camera, no shouting, no statement to perform. Julien glanced up, saw him, and stood. For a moment they both just existed in the same space. No accusations, no questions, just breath and heat and memory. Caleb's voice, when it came, was soft and uncertain. "I don't know if I deserve forgiveness," he said, But if there's something I can do so that no one else has to bleed before they're seen as human, I'll do it. Julien didn't rush to answer. He looked at the flag pinned to Caleb's chest. Not raised, not waved, just carried. You don't need to repay, he said. Just don't be silent next time. The crowd moved on around them. Children laughed. Drums echoed from the next block. Somewhere, a balloon popped. But in the quiet between them, something shifted. Caleb reached into the bag slung at his side and pulled out a worn envelope. The edges were frayed. The fold had been opened and closed too many times. He held it out, but Julien didn't take it. Instead, Julien asked, "Is that the letter?" Caleb nodded. Before he could explain further, Julien gently lifted the edge of the envelope. A second handwriting was scribbled across the back, sharper, older, familiar. It read, "I read it, and I forgive you. Richard Wyatt." Julien looked up, eyes narrowed not in suspicion, but in understanding. "He brought it to me," he said softly. "Your father, a month before he passed, said it wasn't his to keep." Caleb swallowed. The words didn't come. They didn't need to. Richard Wyatt, once unshakable in belief, once louder than Caleb ever dared to be, had chosen silence in the end, but not in the way he used to. He had let the letter speak, and with it, delivered a message of apology neither of them had ever been taught to give. The parade moved past them. Julien slipped the letter into his bag and reached for a bottle of water, handing it to a teenager with smeared glitter on their cheeks. Caleb stepped back into the volunteer line, resumed the small work that had become his way of listening. Later that afternoon, as the crowd began to thin, a boy passed by wearing a hoodie and a familiar rainbow pin. "Tyrese." He caught Caleb's eye. This time, he smiled. It wasn't loud, it wasn't triumphant, but it was enough. Because sometimes, redemption doesn't need to be shouted, it only needs to be lived and carried, like a flag, one heart at a time. What would you do if someone you hurt held your life in their hands? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your story may help someone heal. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to Heartstorie, where true courage begins with compassion.